Now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Audrey Moore is here today because I wanted her to be here. Now switch to my other page of notes. Audrey probably doesn't remember this, but the first time I encountered her was about 10 years ago on this very campus at a conference quite similar to this one, sponsored by the West Kootenay Women's Association. Audrey was one of the speakers, and she said two things I've never forgotten, and which showed two very different facets of this very complex woman. The first was quite shocking to me. She said, "There are two kinds of people in this world. There are the foxes and the chickens, and you know which one you want to be." Audrey, these are your chickens coming home to roost. And then she also said something else. And the fact that she could say both these things was why I wanted her to be here today. And what she said, I made up into the title for her speech. She said, "Whether you're on the left, the right, or the center, women's issues cross party lines. It didn't matter where women sat in the house. When you were in the coffee clutches, when it came to things that mattered to women, there was agreement. They could talk to each other. They understood what they were talking about." And you know, in fact, we're all here today because Audrey wanted us to be here. When we started planning this conference, and the Women's Association realized we wanted to partner with Selkirk College to do it, it was clear that Audrey Moore had to think this was a good idea. And as chair of Selkirk College, Audrey was of the Selkirk College Board. Audrey was instrumental in convincing the powers that be that they wanted to co-sponsor this conference. And between Audrey and Bridie, they really had no choice but to agree. We chose Audrey to speak at this conference because we needed someone who represented the mainstream. Perhaps I could even suggest the right bank of the mainstream. And we wanted someone local, someone who has chosen to serve and be effective in her community here. And Audrey has done that. From librarian to city councillor to mayor of Castlegar from 1977 to 1993, Audrey became a powerful figure in the local community. Her list of community involvements, from regional district to hospital board to the Union of BC Municipalities to chair of Selkirk's board, is literally as long as my arm. I've always liked and admired Audrey Moore from a distance and hoped that I'd never had to tangle with her. When I was thinking about myself as a community activist and as Audrey as the force she is in our communities, at first I thought, gee, Audrey and I could probably not agree on lunch. But then I thought, oh yes, we could. And not only that, but I bet we could agree over lunch. Together we would find our common ground and figure out what we both thought was important enough to make our very different styles and our very different politics work together to achieve it. And this conference is an example of that common ground. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mo, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'm not sure, Mo, when I have been so well introduced. I hope I don't disappoint you all. But before I begin, I have a couple of announcements to make, and one is that in 1999, Selkirk College will be offering a women's studies program. I'm not sure whether I had anything to do with it. I think that, the time has arrived. And to Margaret, who is here, I just want to assure her and say once more to her and to all of you, last evening the cafeteria floor was clean. So thank you, Margaret. And I think, Margaret, you should thank Bridie for that, okay? I have found your conference most stimulating, invigorating, and provocative. And I am going to go straight into what I have to say. I do best at ad-libbing, and I have some notes here that we will feed into it. But as an audience, I knew I had to be prepared. So, we fragment and freeze that which should be moving and dynamic. And as Moe said, we compete when we should cooperate. And I'll use your own theme. A community without confidence, without competence, and without community cooperation only perpetuates cycles of anger. Let me quote to you a bit from a Women's World report. Discrimination against women is profound, and it's a subtle sickness that has lodged itself deep in the subconscious of both men and women, and as well in the structure of our societies. It makes it one of the hardest sources of inequality to fight because it grips women from within and from without. Women's analysis of their courage both to wrestle with their own internalized view of themselves as weak and powerless, not so this weekend, and to begin standing up for their rights, often against men that they love, has cost us dearly. At best, confusion, heartache, and at worst, isolation. But nevertheless, it has put women's concerns and inequalities squarely before the world and squarely before this conference this weekend. Now, you've heard messages from Mary Wu Sims about understanding and tolerance. And she also reminded us that women represent 45.1% of BC's workforce. And we have an honor of a very dubious honor in that in BC, the widest wage gender gap in all of Canada. So there's still much to do. And she also reminded us that we need to be very vigilant about where we are today and where we want to be tomorrow, so that we can leave a positive legacy for our children, especially our daughters. Dr. Fulton has reminded us that there are many, many other models other than the hierarchical model that is so prevalent in our society today to accomplish our aims and our objectives. She told us, and I believe that we should be reminded of it daily, that everything is in motion all at the same time and all interconnected. The other thing that I wrote down, Margaret, was that we should practice the value of sharing and that we should embrace diversity. And if women counted, our work would be given monetary value when the wealth of our country was added up so that all of us could see it. You and I have attended during this conference many of the workshops, and I listened to the voices of women, and I learned about change, and I went to where the new models of interaction were taking place, and I attended Moe's session on the brainstorming session about preventing violence against women in our communities. And I would expect that you're full of ideas and information. And if your thoughts are like mine, they're whirling a bit. So I'm going to slow you down. I was asked to share some of my personal experiences with you this morning. I have some considerable reticence about that topic, just as all women do, for we've been taught for centuries not to talk about our accomplishments. I will try, with your help, to overcome my apprehension in the next 30 or so minutes with the hope that we will all be on time for lunch. Some things you really should know about me, besides what all the things that Moe has said. I'm not sure that's me at all. That's some of the things I became involved in. My motto has always been to act as if what I do makes a difference, with the firm belief that a minority of individuals would someday be yeast enough to leaven the whole of society. I also know that I do not have all the truth, I only have a small piece of it, and as well, that we all filter reality to suit our own level of courage. Enough said. Who and what has formed my level of courage and contributed to my growth and development? When did I know that the world was different for women and men? Well, in my own family. I had 2 brothers older, and I had 2 younger brothers, and I had but 1 sister. The importance of my brothers was greatly valued by my mother and my father. How well I remember the day that I informed the family, and I was even at age 15 informing somebody about something, that I was going to university. My brothers scoffed. My father looked me straight in the eye and said, "But women only marry and have children." But my mother gave me lots of support. Why did she give me lots of support? Well, she and her mother before her had both been teachers, and learning was valued in our family. If you look at that family structure, you'll know that I was right in the middle. So I was always negotiating on behalf of my younger siblings with my older siblings, and sometimes negotiating on behalf of my older siblings with my younger siblings. So very early in life, I learned that you had to negotiate and you had to facilitate. So having informed my family that I was going to university, off at the age of 16, I went to university. And I enrolled in honors science. There were 2 women who enrolled that year, and 2 of us graduated. How was I accepted? Not at all. I was considered an intruder for a while, and then all of a sudden I was someone who could help with labs and with reports. I became a value-added person, the buzzword of today. Now presently there is a strong program abroad in our land to recruit women for the study of science. That's progress. And I think it's probably about time. Now, Margaret asked me which university I attended. I went to the University of New Brunswick, Margaret, the 2nd oldest university in Canada, founded in 1759. How's that? And I feel right at home in a gymnasium because I played varsity sports at UNB, and in those days, there was very little money for women's teams. So who joined the student council to secure funding? You guessed it. Then I decided that I would manage the team as well as play in order to ensure that the funding continued. You see, I was an activist from the cradle almost. Upon completing university, I was hired by the National Research Council, the Oceanographic Division, to work at the St. Andrews Biological Station. What did I do? Well, that was interesting. What did I do? I was a research officer at age 20. Now this is having, you know, that wasn't very old. Even in those days, that wasn't very old. And I was on a boat out, and then we went out every day into the Passamaquoddy Bay and the Bay of Fundy to sample water for temperature and salinity. And I had an all-male crew on the boat, complete with captain, and no, I did not make the coffee. And I did not make lunch. The captain made lunch. But for some reason or other, I managed to gain the respect of the captain and the crew. Was I ever sexually harassed on that job? Yes, I was, but certainly not by the crew of that boat, but by My supervisor, my boss, who I guess in retrospect he was a colonel in the army, and in those days they had all power. Anyway, I was drafting one day at a table, and he leaned over and he patted me on the shoulder, and I turned around and I said, "Never touch me again," okay? Next week, I wanted to go back to my home in Fredericton, and I needed to get off work early. So I went to see Colonel Hashey, and I said, "Do you suppose I could leave early?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Is it anything to do with what I said to you last week?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Fine, I'll take the later bus." We became friends over the years. But I just wanted you to know that those things can be handled, and they did happen in those days. With all the things that you're hearing about sexual harassment these days in the armed forces, I have a daughter who's in the armed forces, and I called Susan the other day, and I said, "And how are you doing, and how many times have you been sexually harassed in the armed forces?" So she said, "I've been in 20 years, and I have never been sexually harassed." But she said, "I handle myself well, Mother, and you should be proud of me." And I said, "Good on you." But there are things happening there. But Susan, my daughter, is a sergeant, and I would say to you right now that any of the people that she has and supervises will be safe from sexual harassment. But going back, let me go back, I digress. You see, early in that same year in St. Andrews, I was approached by some high school girls, and I was asked if I would teach them to play basketball. There was only one problem. They hadn't used the gym for about 10 years, and the gym had a leaky roof and the floor was buckled. So what did you do? That gymnasium was called the Lady Dunn Memorial Gymnasium. So I thought, write a letter to Lady Dunn and ask her if she knows that the building named after her has a leaky roof and a buckled floor. And so I did that. And the roof was fixed. And I did teach those young women to play basketball, and we went to our first provincial tournament, and we won the second section. The one thing that makes me very proud is that later, one of those young women that I taught to play basketball was so good, not because of me, but because of her own determination. She played on a team representing Canada. Now that was lesson 9 or 10 in my life, I guess, and said to me that nothing is impossible, problems are challenges, or better still, they're opportunities. Yes, I married a forester, and I moved to a small French-speaking village on the north shore of Quebec. Did I learn another language? Yes, because I like to talk, and I couldn't talk. But before I did, I was asked to teach the women in that village how to curl and help build their curling rink. And that was yet another opportunity to test my level of courage. And if you've ever tried to teach somebody something and you don't have their language, you become full of body language, and I have never given it up, okay? In the early 60s, we moved to Pointe Claire, and I was the ultimate volunteer, that person that does all things for everybody. I volunteered for the home and school, it was called that in those days, and the hospital auxiliary, and I was a library volunteer, and I was a guide captain. And we had 3 active children, and my husband traveled all week. So I was almost a single parent. One of our children had a learning disability, and I was determined that he should have some help. And I was instrumental in having the learning assistants incorporated in the school curriculum in that school board on the West Island in the early 1960s, and it's still there. Well, I moved all across Canada, I should tell you that. And when our family arrived in Edmonton in 1968-69, and I became involved there with the University of Alberta in a course entitled A Second Look for Women. And many of the women in that course had married very young, and they had small children. And that was a long time before daycare was available to young mothers. These young women knew that something was missing in their lives, and I, with the help of many others, helped redirect them into courses at the university. So I was still pushing the woman's envelope. I have been pushing it for a long time. How and why did we arrive in Castlegar? Well, we came here via Prince George. my husband was offered a teaching position at Selkirk College in 1970. Where was the women's movement in all of this? I would say it was in its infancy, just beginning. I like this story. It's a story that I told. It's an excerpt from a speech I gave in 1995 to our University Women's Club about the role of women in Canadian politics. And it's a story about Laura Sabia. She was then president in 1966. She was president of the Canadian Federation of University Women, and she decided to vigorously support and promote a Royal Commission on the Status of Women. She called together the heads of 30 women's organizations to act across all party lines. This call of hers united women of all political beliefs around the core issue. Hundreds and thousands of women were involved. There's a story told by her son Michael that at dinner one night the phone rang, and during the conversation he heard his mother say, "You tell the Prime Minister I'll lead an uprising of Canadian women to Ottawa." The next day, the Globe and Mail carried this headline, "2 million women may march on Ottawa." This headline, rightly so, unsettled the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Pearson, and the result was he announced the Royal Commission on the Status of Women on February 17th, 1967. That was only 100 years after Confederation. That's quite a while. The Royal Commission report generated a new solidarity and political will among a whole generation of women, of which I was one. The barriers to political power were beginning to crumble, pebble by pebble and stone by stone. Since that time, I believe women have never looked back, but moved ever forward into the mainstream of Canadian society, much as I did. As I said earlier, our family moved to Castlegar in 1970. And where did I find the courage to stand for the local council? Well, in the spring of '97, as Mo has told you, I was hired as the Castlegar librarian. And the council of the day would not adequately fund the library. I think they gave the library something like $2,000 or $3,000. This was an important and vital service to many of the people. So, go where the decisions are made. And I went. Without an organization of any kind, without a network of support or a support system, without a mentor. I refused to join a slate and I ran independently. I spent $100 in advertising. I espoused and supported the two contentious issues of the day, amalgamation and a sewer system. And lo, I was elected in 1973 to an all-male council. Believe it or not. I was more surprised than anybody else. Yes, I got there and I was shunned, I was patronized, I was given impossible tasks. My ideas were no good until they were recycled a week later by one of my male peers. Nevertheless, I was not daunted. I managed almost the impossible, gained the respect of my fellow councillors. I found a mentor in the then mayor of Castlegar, Mayor Mosby. When I first joined council, he said, "What do I call you, Audrey?" That's when they called members of council aldermen. He said, "I know, I shall call you Alder Thing." Okay? Never mind, he was a wonderful mentor and he had a wonderful sense of humor. And I was very honored to be asked by his wife to be an honorary pallbearer at his funeral. And women don't do that, but I did. Anyway, in 1977, I ran against 4 men for the position of mayor. I think they thought they would overcome me with numbers, I'm not sure what. But anyway, I succeeded, and as many of you know, for 17 years, I helped the people of this city govern their municipality and their regional district. And we had some accord at that time with the regional district. Didn't we, Rosemary? In total, I served in elected office for about 20 years. When I began on the council in 1973, there was one woman. That was me. And during that time, there were as many as 4 out of 7 women on that council, because I actively recruited women to run for office in those years. Now, 25 years later, there's but 1 woman on that council. And I ask all of you here, why is that? Where are you? Why are you not there? But that 20 years in elected office gave me many, many opportunities to fill some interesting positions in both BC and Canada. I was president of the Union of BC Municipalities in 1984-85. I was only the second woman in the 75-year history of that organization to hold the presidency. At that time, there have been quite a few, well, not quite a few, I think there's been 4 or 5 since. I remember when I was to move up to table officer, I was visited by the then male president, and I was asked to move aside and wait for another year or so. And I replied no, that I'd earned the position, and I would move up to table officer. It would be at the pleasure of the membership whether I made it or not, but I didn't think I'd accept his advice that time. I enjoyed my term with the UBCM, and I'd like to believe, and I think, I honestly do believe that I helped mold the UBCM to its present position of prominence in British Columbia, because I believe that I opened the organization up. And in 1993, having served for 10 years on the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, when I was, 1993, I didn't win an election. But at that time, I was the first vice president of the Canadian organization. But that organization was good to me, and very recently, about a year and a half ago or so, they called me and asked me if I would help them do some work on local government in the Union of South Africa. It was an interesting project, and I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. During my 10 years on that executive, I developed a very wide network of contacts and friends across Canada. This network is still very important to me today in my work at Selkirk College and elsewhere, and it's rare that I don't, when I'm flying and I go into an airport, it's a rare day that I don't meet somebody that I knew from across Canada. Now, my years on council presented some very interesting challenges and many opportunities for my growth and development. And one of the things that I really enjoyed was being vice chair of the Provincial Library Task Force, and I traveled throughout British Columbia listening to all those wonderful people who use libraries, and listening to their concerns about the lack of funds and the lack of appropriate legislation at the provincial level. Again, I'd like to say, I know our report and our recommendations were accepted by the government of the day, and they were enacted, and life has become a lot better for libraries. When I mentioned earlier that when I went on this library, I think we got $2,500. I think today the funding for that library in Castlegar from the city is well in excess of $200,000. And so things do happen, and people make them happen. One of the other opportunities I had, I was a member of the BC Police Commission for about 6 years, and that's when we had the first police complaint commissioner, citizen complaint commissioner in the province, and that was interesting work. This one really gave me a buzz when I was asked to be chair of a task force on agricultural land and its interface with residential areas. Now there I was being sent off by the UBCM to do the impossible, and I had cattle ranchers, and I had farmers from the north, and I had all male, chicken farmers and pig farmers from the Fraser Valley, and we were supposed to come up with some sort of a resolution so that they could police themselves, so that they wouldn't cause odors and farm operations to denigrate and degrade the residential properties close by. That was probably one of the most challenging things I ever did. We managed, but I had to work hard at gaining respect in that group. One of the other things that I particularly was interested in, I was asked to serve on a committee, a working committee structured by the Union of BC Municipalities to work on the freedom of information legislation when it came into being in this province. And it's presently being reviewed, and I say to each of you, unless you want that legislation to disappear and be weakened so that it can never be used effectively, to sit there and do nothing, and that's exactly what will happen. But I suggest to you that you take an interest, that you take an active interest, and that you help preserve that legislation, because it is good for all of us. In 1991, 92, and 93, I was part of a working group along with Rosemary and Josh Schmink and any number of other people that founded a group, of the founding group of the Columbia Basin, sort of what's turned into the Columbia Basin Trust and the Power Corporation. Indeed, in 1993, at the first symposium, which I helped organize in Castlegar, I made the opening speech. Nobody told me that I had to just be polite, so I made an opening speech with content for a change that challenged the government of the day to come up with just such an organization as the Columbia Basin Trust and the Columbia Power Corp to begin righting the wrongs and injustices of the past. So that was an interesting opportunity. Now, what did I learn from all of this? Well, I would say this to all of you. I want you to take your courage at whatever level it is, and your talents, because I know there are many, and your competence, because we are always developing competence. And I want you to take your confidence and your will to make a difference and join boards in your community, stand for council, or MLA, or MP, and I can give you this assurance. You will have a wide range of experience. You will be challenged every day of your life. You will establish a vast network of contacts, and you will acquire the ability to manage yourself and help others. You'll be in a position to mentor other women effectively, and you will improve the decisions of the groups that you join. For I believe to facilitate change, you must participate in the major decision-making bodies of society. In order to help restructure our institutions on the basis of real equality, help resolve concrete, practical, everyday problems of living, working, and loving as equal persons. This is the personal and political business of the day for all of us. It will certainly reduce violence against women and children, for I believe only the powerless are violated. And to do this, you're going to need some help. As I mentioned earlier, mentorship is very important. And I think women who are part of organizations should actively help and encourage other women to join and take part. I think if you become elected, you should really convene a round table of advisors and touch base with them frequently. Women's organizations, Mo, maybe you do it already, but I believe they should establish a file of women able and willing to serve on community, provincial, and federal boards and commissions. And I think they should compile a list of these local and provincial boards and commissions that can be shared with interested women. Now, I know that's a difficult task because the boards and commissions in this province, I had a printout of them one time, and I think it went something like this. Is that right, Mo? Anyway, I think that needs to be done. You don't have to print them all, but you should be selective, and I think we all should support women with the courage to seek elected office. Because, you know, it takes a fair number of women in any organization to make a difference. And you might say, well, what is that? And from my reading, it says it's about 25%. Then you begin to make quite a difference. I think if you do all of this, I'm full of a great deal of optimism for an expanded role for women in our world. And I want to share with you something that is recent and it's topical. And it's an excerpt from the Trend Letter of March 5th, 1998, and it's entitled The Feminine Instinct for Leadership. Gender barriers crumble as economy and attitudes shift. I'm just going to read some of it to you. From Kenya to Japan to New Zealand, the fast-changing global economy is knocking down old hierarchies. Do you hear that, Margaret? Old hierarchies. And they're vaulting women to positions of unprecedented leadership and power. I'll just read part. Many would argue that women have always had to work harder to earn respect and responsibility on the job and to develop a thicker skin regarding realities such as the glass ceiling. Now the dawning of the new century signals a brand new reality. I'm not sure I want to read this line, but anyway, Darwin would be pleased. Women's experience make them better survivors during downsizing and are making them success stories today. Armed with education and experience, women are masters, so to speak, of today's most important leadership skills: building team consensus, motivating the ranks, fostering communication, flexibility, and risk-taking. With few, this is interesting, I'm not sure I agree with it, with few female models to mold themselves after, women bring fresh ideas and an openness to alternative viewpoints. I have the complete article, and I have some copies, and if you want it, you can pick it up here. Just to summarize, it says, decades of activism have produced a broad range of progressive laws guaranteeing girls and women access to education and jobs. Now the momentum of the new economy is mandating women's rise to power, especially in developing countries that desperately need qualified leaders, and in countries whose aging populations are growing at a rate far faster than the workforce, threatening to bankrupt pension systems. In these countries, working women may well determine which graying society will be prosperous ones. So there you have it, and I think that's a tremendous challenge. And I would say to you that the opportunities are limitless. And I came across this article that, if you don't read the Vancouver Province, and I rarely read it, but I read it this day, and it says, women are finding more doors open to them today. The sky is the limit, okay? So I think you could gather from some of the things I've said that I've enjoyed doing some of the research for this presentation. And if we're to address the issues, the important issues facing women today, and those important issues in my mind are poverty and violence against women, it pleases me to say that I believe women and our issues have slipped into the mainstream of society, and we have become part of the whole social debate. You know, I also, with this trend letter, there is a bit of a reading list that I compiled of articles that are in the Selkirk College library, and there's also some helpful hints. If you really want to run for public office, you might have a look at it. It just tells you how to get some help, all the help that I didn't even know I needed. You know, I think our opportunities and our achievements are almost, can be determined basically by our own imagination. If you can visualize yourself doing something, then you can do it. And maybe that goes back to what my very strong mother told me when I was growing up, that you could do anything if you set your mind to it. And I've listened to some of the workshops today, and I know some of you need some assistance in trying to arrive at some solutions to some very difficult problems. I have shared my card with some people. I am available. I will sign the sheet to be a mentor. But just to remind you how far we've come and how many people have gone before you, I will close by quoting from the woman who is the founder of the women's movement in Canada, Nellie McClung, and she said this in 1917, if you can believe it. She said, "The country is yours, ladies. Politics is simply public affairs, yours and mine. The government has enfranchised you, but it cannot emancipate you. This is done by your own process of thought." So good luck. Thank you. You're making me very humble. Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you.
So we'll have a brief question period. People have any questions?
Questions? That's wonderful. I mean, I was that clear? Yes.